Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Wonderful to have you in our webinar live briefing today. My name is Bibi van Ginkel. I'm the program lead of the PCVE pillar at the ICCT. For those who do not know ICCT is an independent think and do tank established in 2010 and based in The Hague. We operate as a hub or platform between academia and experts, international, national, and local policymakers and practitioners. And we provide research, policy advice, monitoring and evaluation, training, technical assistance, and other solutions to support better, effective, and legitimate counter-terrorism policies and practices worldwide. We also contribute to the scientific and public debates in the fields on CT and PCVE, notably through publications and events such as this. We work with various governments, international organizations and agencies, universities and think tanks, as well as with NGOs. Our activities are global, but we have a focus over the last years on Europe, West Balkans, the Middle East, Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. ICCT has three main pillars: the rule of law pillar, the current and emerging trends and threat pillar, and the PCVE pillar. And in addition, we have the cross-cutting work of our strategic communications experts and the Monitoring and Evaluation Center of Excellence. For today, we will discuss the spillover effects of the Israel-Hamas conflict impacting the narratives in Europe, West Balkan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Africa. Through our network, we have been monitoring the impact of the conflict beyond the borders of Gaza, and you might have seen the various publications on the conflict, the main players, and the implications elsewhere on our website. The impact of the Israel-Hamas conflict extends well beyond the geographical border of the conflict. Not only are direct neighboring states impacted through incidental attacks by proxies and responses by Israel or allies, destabilizing the broader region, but the impact of the war is also tangible beyond the Middle East. The conflict has polarized the public debate in many countries and brought people to the street in protests. In the Middle East itself, it has also had a polarizing effect, and the tensions have also resulted in serious threats to Muslims and Jewish organizations, terrorist attacks, and foiled plots in Western Europe. Mis- and disinformation are furthermore fueling these fractures. Meanwhile, several arrests have been made in Western Europe, of which the most remarkable was related to the arrest of members of a Hamas terrorist cell planning attacks against Jewish organizations in Europe. Terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are moreover capitalizing on the real or perceived anger of Muslim communities towards the West and are calling their supporters to plan attacks in the West. Beyond Western Europe and the Middle East, in other parts of the world, the conflict also divides communities and creates tensions between governments and communities because the policies are met with criticism and responses to critical voices are not always constructive. Particularly American or European actors and donors are scrutinized and are banned, making it hard to continue capacity building activities. The resentment against the West that was in several regions already present is further exacerbated, partly due to mis- and disinformation and Western countries' positions vis-à-vis the conflict. It furthermore has a paralyzing impact on some diplomatic representations that are confronted with credibility issues. So the long-term effects of this built-up tension and eroding trust are undermining US and EU objectives to build strong partnerships to enhance security cooperations. Such anti-West sentiments might moreover be exacerbated and instrumentalized as part of violent extremist groups' propaganda and recruitment strategies. The events furthermore keep on evolving with further implications on the conflict and the regions elsewhere. I'm just briefly mentioning the veto in the UN on the membership of Palestine, the aggravating security situation between Iran and Israel, the situation regarding UNRWA, and the negotiations of a coalition of the willing on a new sanction regime against Hamas. In this webinar, the speakers will take us on a quick tour of the world, reflecting on the spillover effects of the Israel-Hamas conflict. Although we have selected 5 regions and countries, we could have easily extended the scope. This webinar also provides input for a research proposal ICCT is working on, which aims to assess perceptions of the populations and key stakeholders in a number of regions vis-à-vis Israel, Hamas, the Palestinians, their own government, the role of civil society, the impact on polarization, and perceptions vis-à-vis Western donors, depending on a number of future scenarios of how this conflict can evolve. The data retrieved from surveys and interviews would provide important insights in how the spillover impact we today start to talk about will further develop. And I invite potential donors participating in this seminar who are interested to come and find us if they are willing to also donate to this project. Today, I ask my speakers to reflect on the following questions. How is this conflict impacting the public debate? Is there a nuanced dialogue still possible in your country, in your region? Does the conflict have a horizontal or vertical polarizing effect in society? Are there signs of perceived grievances turning into a ground for recruitment? What is the perception of the population and government vis-à-vis Western countries supporting Israel's right to defend itself? And what are the effects of these perceptions on Western interests and or potential for Western donor support in certain regions? Now, my speakers today, and in this order, will present on the impact on Africa. And for that, we have Martin Ewi, Senior Researcher at ISS and also Associate Fellow of ICCT. We have on the impact on Iraq, Kamran Palani, who's also an Associate Fellow of ICCT. On the impact of Lebanon, Christina Pour, who is the co-founder of Fighters for Peace in Lebanon. On the impact of West Balkan, we have Adrian Stooney, CEO and Principal Consultant of Stooney Consulting, and also Associate Fellow of ICCT. And on the impact in Dutch cities, we have Taco Temmink-Townstra, Senior Advisor to the Mayor of Amsterdam, and who works on crisis and incident management, and also is the coordinator on demonstrations and regarding the portfolio on discrimination. So you can see we take you on a tour from south to north. We ask each speakers to present for about 12 to 15 minutes, and after that I will gladly ask the audience to ask their questions after each presentation. And for that, you can use the Q&A function, which you find at the bottom of your screen of this Zoom meeting. Don't wait till the end. I will keep track of your questions. And so between each of the presentations, we will have this short break. Furthermore, after the third presentation, there will be a very short a break for a coffee refill, for stretching your legs, just 5 minutes, and then we resume. Before we start the presentations, let me remind you that we are recording and streaming this on YouTube. So if you have an issue with that, I suppose that you step out of the meeting. But with that, I'm very glad to ask my first speaker to give his thoughts on the questions. And for that, I turn to Martin Ewi from ISS South Africa. Martin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Bibi, for that excellent introduction. I will apologize upfront for my voice, which is due to a flu wave that is going across South Africa, and I'm one of the unfortunate to catch it at its early days. Indeed, I would like to join you in expressing the importance of this topic, which indeed, as you have presented, has left Africa balkanized. Africa has been divided over the subject matter for reasons that are both pragmatic and to some extent theoretical. I will, in assessing the spillover effect on Africa, I will look at it from the implications on terrorism itself, the implication on international relations and diplomacy, and the implications on future trends in terrorism on the continent. When we look at this, especially from the perspective of terrorism, what we have seen has been that initially we have terrorist groups that competed for interest. Many of them utilize this conflict to kind of radicalize more people. We saw this especially with Al-Shabaab, which is operating from the Horn of Africa, specifically in Somalia and part of Kenya and Uganda. Al-Shabaab actually was the one that used this to its greatest effect. We saw a lot of campaign from Al-Shabaab where they were actually using the conflict to radicalize youth, telling them about the nature of the conflict and casting itself also as freedom fighters. So the conflict provided Al-Shabaab with that opportunity for Al-Shabaab to recast itself as freedom fighters. And this also meant that Al-Shabaab's fight with the Somali government actually increased. And we saw that increment when Al-Shabaab was able to recruit at least 1,000 militants during this period. Something that has been really, really drastic at a point that we believe Al-Shabaab was losing a lot of popularity. So this conflict to a larger extent did provide Al-Shabaab with that platform to mobilize more people in favor of their cause. So what Al-Shabaab actually did was to increase its militarization, also at a critical time that the African Union forces based in Somalia, AMISOM, were withdrawing. And those areas that were abandoned by the African Union and the Somali forces were quickly taken over by Al-Shabaab, meaning that what we have seen since this conflict began has been again in territory by Al-Shabaab, something that was not the case previously because Al-Shabaab had actually lost a lot of grounds, but they have recovered quite a number of territories since this conflict began. We also saw some sort of collaboration among terror groups in the region, where they were able to liaise with each other to kind of set aside their differences. A critical one is the conflict between Al-Qaeda groups, the Jama al-Nusra Wal Jasmine, which has been the umbrella group of Al-Qaeda groups in Mali, in northern Mali, or one would say in the Sahel region, the JNIM. The JNIM had been on loggerhead with the Islamic State Sahel province. As you know, the Islamic State for the Greater Sahara, which was later transformed, bringing together some other groups, especially like the Ansar Din, which is a group that split along Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. So part of the Ansar Din joined the new Islamic State Sahel province. They have actually been in conflict for quite a while, but we have seen collaboration between the two recently, and we assume that this collaboration, though may have been caused by other factors, the conflict in the Middle East, the Israel-Palestinian conflict, actually provided some fuel for them to be able to find a common enemy. So what we see then is a conflict which when it came to Africa, the African population initially supported the Israeli response as a legitimate fight for self-defense. But as the Israeli incursion or Israeli bombardment of Palestine continued, that support for Israel began to dwindle. And it has dwindled up to the point today where the support for Israel is very, very minute. Now, why was this support for Israel very important? As you know, Israel has excellent, one would say, yeah, I would call it excellent relations with many African countries, particularly on the security platform. So many people don't know this, but Israel has been able to sign security agreement with quite a number of African countries, where Israel has been providing critical weapons that these countries need. And also, as we see recently, Israel was able to provide many of these countries with spying instrument, espionage instrument that they have been able to use. Israel has been training quite a number of African forces, which led, because of these relations that Israel enjoy with many African countries, in 2021, Israel was able to win their support to accept Israel as an observer member of the African Union, something that was later on suspended after the incursion, after this escalation of the conflict in 2023, in October 2023. So Israel lost most of that support, even though in the hindsight, though publicly these countries have actually spoken against Israel, but we still see this collaboration at the operational level because, as you know, there have been a lot of protests across the continent where African population reacted bitterly to what they see as an exaggeration of self-defense from the side of Israel, saying that they went beyond what was considered to be self-defense to what I think the South African case at the International Court of Justice brought out the real mindset of the African, that this was genocide. And genocide went beyond self-defense. So as you know, because of this popular support and African countries actually supporting the fact that Israel went beyond board, this actually also kind of mellow the terrorist reaction to the situation in Israel, because they now found African countries to be in solidarity with their views that the reaction of Israel has been nothing but hyperbolic. It's been beyond what anyone can imagine to bring back the plight of Palestinians. So instead, what we see, it's a lot of support for Palestine, a lot of sympathy for Palestine. That sympathy that Israel had at the beginning kind of evaporated. So we have increase in radicalization, as we have seen. We've seen increase in recruitment that these terrorist groups have been able to capitalize on. And as you know, in terms of attacks, we saw earlier on, especially at the beginning of this year, we saw an increase in terrorist attacks in many of the regions where the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda operate. I'm referring, for example, to the situation in Mozambique, where earlier on, especially the beginning of this year, where there was that order from Al-Qaeda, from the Islamic State, requesting affiliate to increase attacks, and that call was answered by the groups in Mozambique, particularly the Al-Shabaab or the so-called the Islamic State's affiliate in Mozambique, where they responded with increased attacks. They've been able to establish a caliphate So Mozambique today has a caliphate, the Islamic caliphate, which has been operating since late last year. And the manner in which this caliphate has been operating in Mozambique differs significantly from what we saw in Syria and Iraq, meaning that the Islamic State has been able to draw lessons from what happened in Iraq, from its caliphate in Iraq, to kind of a new dawn in Africa, where they believe that if they can control certain territory, if they can run the caliphate in a peaceful way, but are able to collect taxes and so on, they can significantly reduce attacks. So we saw that to the point where the Islamic State actually wrote to Mozambican government requesting for that calm, to say if Mozambique government does not attack them, they will not also attack civilians. That kind of created some sort of balance. But we've seen a lot of mobilization and attacks by the Mozambican insurgents across. They've actually been to areas where they have not been before, meaning that they are actually expanding. Then if we look at in terms of attacks in the Sahel, though we saw an increase, though we saw a new territorial control, especially by the Islamic State group, which was never the case before, particularly in northern Mali. But this has been influenced by quite a number of factors, one being the military coup that took place in the region, which kind of really affected security cooperation in some of these countries. The other factor has been the exit of the United Nations Stabilization Force that used to control access to northern Mali, where their exit actually encouraged these groups to expand into these new abandoned territories, which we have seen. And we've seen many of these groups also using this opportunity to mobilize funds. We've seen them continue to exploit resources, especially gold in the Lutako-Goma region. The Lutako-Goma region, which is the tri-border area bringing together Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. That tri-border region has been one of the most unstable places on earth today, and that has been because of the Islamist influence and their exploitation of resources in the region. So the conflict has provided, that cover for these groups to expand even further. Then let me quickly also talk about the collaboration between Al-Shabaab and the Allied Democratic Forces that we have seen. As you know, these groups are all based in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the eastern part of that country. We've seen increased collaboration between them since the October 7 attacks took place. Is it because of the dynamics in the region? It could be, but there are other dynamics within the continent that could have influenced this collaboration. Remember, the ADF is actually the anchor group for the Islamic State Central Africa Province, ISCAP. That has been operating and which has been part of the Mozambique insurgency in that region also. So we've seen also with them this new radicalization and increase in recruitment, where they've been able to recast themselves as freedom fighters, linking countries that support Israel as infidels or countries that need to be eliminated. Let me also then talk about the implications on international relations and diplomacy in Africa. As I've said, that Israel has suffered losses in terms of diplomacy from the African continent, losses which really, I think, hit them badly, because Israel had actually, before this 7 October conflict, had actually made significant inroad into bringing Africa towards Israel. And as I said, that they actually became an observer member of the African Union, something that has been historic and unprecedented for Israel to participate in these meetings. But this conflict has shattered that dream for Israel, and that's international relations. African countries have utilized the United Nations. Many of them have voted in favor of Palestine in most of I would say all the resolutions that have been tabled within the Security Council for ceasefire and for the new one which relate to the independence, the sovereign state of Palestine. African countries have voted in favor because the position of the continent remains one of two-state solution, that Israel will not find peace. Palestine will not find peace if the two continue to exist the way they are in a very, very imbalanced nature, where one is an occupier and the other one is an oppressed group. And therefore, African countries are calling for a two-state solution. The quick or rapid granting of independence to Palestine, because once Palestine is independent, it can be accountable for the atrocities that Hamas and other groups, Hezbollah included, are committing against Israel. But if things remain the way they are, where Palestine, you remember, Africa has a very strong position when it comes to colonization. There is no way an African country will condone any aspect of colonization. Morocco has been a victim of that, and Israel has also been a victim. The Israeli occupation of Palestine has been referred to in many quarters of the continent as genocide, as apartheid, which is what has really brought in South Africa to say we cannot see apartheid anywhere and stay quiet. So international diplomacy has really been affected with countries not supporting Israel as they should. But those corporations, those security corporations that existed, none of them has actually been publicly, how do I say, dissolved, because they still exist, meaning Israel can still invoke them. But what happened is that many of these security corporations have gone underground because African countries recognize Israel's competence when it comes to security in this context.
Martin.
Then the last point I just want to mention, which then I will hand the floor over, is what are the implications for the future of terrorism in Africa? What we see, and we know that this conflict, this conflict in the Middle East that has been there for over 75 years today, and it has been the epicenter of terrorism. Terrorism has been generated a lot by what is going on in that part of the world. And it will continue to be the springboard, the fuel for global terrorism to come even within Africa, because it provides a context for these groups to continue to exploit it and to use it as a call to their militant to support them. Let me end here. Maybe there's just a lot to talk about, but I believe we'll do a more focused discussion in the question and answer session. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. Well, you also had quite a task taking us through a whole continent, which is compared to the others who can either talk about a country or a city, at least not as fast as the area that you had to cover. And thank you for highlighting some of these developments. I think for many, these are actually really new insights that they are getting. One question that maybe is still to be answered, also that we were wondering about, is how do perceptions change with regard to Western interests? Western donors active in various countries in Africa. Do you see that there are any perceptions regarding the bias or double standards that is then that the Western states are accused of? Do you see any of that?
Sorry, should I answer or we take
Yes,
a
please.
set of questions?
Please answer. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. This is a very important question because the conflict has, in a broader sense, affected Africa's relations with Europe and America. Excuse me. As you know, America is packing its bags and whatever, leaving the Sahel, especially Niger, which it's something that it's sad, and I think it's all part of this. There might be broader factors contributing to America's departure from the Sahel. But what we have seen, the African mindset has been really an anger against Europe. Europe has not been balanced. Europe has not been fair. Europe has not acted in a way that can bring responsibility to the Middle East. We've seen Europe on the one hand supporting Israel, providing everything that Israel needs to commit genocide. And on the other hand, we see a few, pocket of European individuals, calling for mediation, calling for a settled resolution, of which their countries continue to provide heavy weapons to Israel. And Israel is really counting on this. For example, Israel was able to take Iran to the UN Security Council, something that every African laughed about, that they never knew that Israel respect the Security Council to be able to take a case of this nature. Israel was the one that provoked Iran. But when Iran responded, Israel took Iran to the Security Council calling for a meeting. It's because Israel knows that all Western countries and America are going to support them. Israel will not take a case to the Security Council if they know that we ourselves have not respected any of the Security Council's decisions. So because of the West's double standard, and I think we saw that in Ukraine, we've seen it now also. It has always been there for the case of Israel. Israel has been an untouchable baby, a baby that is allowed to do whatever they want, but you cannot do anything to them. And I think the situation that we face today in the world, many Africans have attributed it to the Caucasian race for their double standard, for on the one hand calling for principles and values and so on and so forth, but when it comes to them, they want to be excluded. Meaning that they are using principles and other international institutions to prosecute others and not themselves. So this has really exposed the West to the point where many see stupidity, many see, an unfair regime, and to say the world is heading towards a third world war. For why? Why do we need it? Why is it that we cannot just exercise justice across the board? Israel's existence should actually be based on justice, not injustices, because there is no way Israel can continue to exist through injustice. And therefore, the African population is calling for that justice to say, yes, we accept the existence of Israel, but it should exist as part of justice. Everyone has now come to accept their existence. We should stop this whole thing of saying Israel will not exist if there is justice and we need to give it weapons. Israel is not going to survive because it has nuclear weapons. That's not the way we see peace in the Middle East. We see peace in the Middle East to be something that has to be balanced. Everyone has to be within the international law and order, and no country should be above the law. And if we are able to implement that, I think there will be peace in the Middle East. So the West really has lost Africa's respect. You've seen what is happening to France. France has really been brought to book in that part of the world. France is really a shadow of itself. And this has also been extended to a number of European countries. We've seen America also being bundle as part of that, because Africans are now really disappointed and frustrated by the West double standard, which has not helped anyone. It is taking the world again towards World War III. The West are the people who caused World War I. They are those who caused World War II. Why must we always be in wars? So this is the situation that we face today in Africa, and we have to address it the way we see the Pax Africana, as it is called. Thank you very much, Bibi.
Thank you very much, Martin, for taking us on this tour and also into the mind of most of the Africans. This is not only necessarily your opinion, but you're vocalizing the views of a lot of the Americans. With that, we cover this part of the session. We are now moving a little bit more north to Iraq. Just reminding everyone that you can use the Q&A function. Also, towards the end, we still have time to answer some questions. And I see one is coming in now, but we are moving on now to Kamran in Iraq. Kamran Palani, you can talk about the situation in Iraq. Please, the floor is yours. Have we lost him?
He has to turn on the
Kamran, you're
microphone.
muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your detailed presentation and introduction, as well as moderating the panel. So, given the complexity of the situation and the topic, I would like to summarize and categorize my thoughts into 5 key points. But before that, I would like to say that my thoughts are very Iraq specific. However, some of the points can be helpful to understand the wider region, including the dynamics in Lebanon, the dynamics in Yemen and other parts of the country. So my first point is that Iraq had a very stable government before 7th of October. Arguably, it was the most stable government Iraq has had since 2003. It was stable partly because of all of the organizations, armed organizations, political parties that have the ability to destabilize the country were part of the government and were happy with the government. So there was kind of consensus between the even armed organizations that operating outside the government that there should be no attacks on American bases, Western bases in Iraq, in order to allow the government to further stabilize the situation. So that was the political context before 7th of October. And then 7th of October came in. It has significantly threatens Iraq's short-term stability. So in Iraq, if I simplify, there are armed organizations operate outside the approval and the framework of the government. Some of them are aligned with Iran strategically, so they respond to broader Iran's broader strategic activities and objectives in the Middle East. So as Iran has been leading the narrative in the Middle East, mobilizing groups against Israel, this has direct and immediate impact on Iraq's security, as well as the narrative of people. So the several armed groups in Iraq started attacking American bases as a response to what's happening in Israel. Americans are seen as supporters of Israel. Then there is no need to differentiate between attacking Israelis and attacking Americans. So if you look at the statistics, I think Iraq has had more than 150 attacks by these groups on American bases. Americans started responding them, attacking them directly. So Iraq became a very active party to the conflict. The short-term stabilization the country had prior to the 7th of October started to change and threatening the entire stability of the country. So that is my first point about how the conflict in Gaza has changed the security and political dynamics across the country and in Iraq. The second point, the West, including the United States, are perceived to be holding double standards, and their support for Israel are viewed as endorsing aggression and violence, which contrasts with their conventional stance of supporting human rights, democracy, and international norms. Here, there are some nuances we need to explain. When people see the West as such, they don't only refer to the government, to the politicians. They refer to the entire institutions in this part of the world, including research organizations, universities, as think tanks. So the entire institutions in these places. In Iraq, there were, I have personally observed individual cases of people leaving projects about peace building, coexistence, youth participation, prevention of violent extremism. I've seen people leaving these projects as a way of showing their dissatisfaction with the donors, with the research organizations, with the humanitarian organizations coming coming from the Western contexts working in these regions. So here, I think it's significant. It's not just about people not happy with specific actions of specific Western governments. For example, 2003 war, people were not happy with the countries. Some people were not happy with the countries were directly involved within the Iraq war. This time, it's about the Western concept, the concept of the West, the collective West, that is people, trying to define them as holding double standards in this context. So, in my view, this is different to the previous phases of people's unhappiness and disappointment with certain government actions. This time is about the entire concept. And in my view, nothing has that significantly eroded and damaged the Western moral superiority than the current conflict in Gaza, even more than what happened in Afghanistan, more than what happened in Iraq after 2003. So this is a different issue. It requires a comprehensive response, and unfortunately, it takes time for many of us, for many organizations, to restore trust with the wider population of these contexts, specifically in Iraq. And then this was my second point. My third point. The broader war in Gaza has amplified the influence of hardliners within various and diverse religious groups, including Salafis and Muslim Brotherhood organization. So in Iraq and even in places like Kurdistan, that these groups have been in a defensive position for many years have not been able to talk openly. The conflict, the devastating impact of the war has just emboldened these hardliners, providing them space with a pretext to advance their agendas openly. Now, in Iraq, including in Kurdistan, where I have observed the developments since 7th of October, the voices of moderation, voices of peace and coexistence are now on defense, are in a defensive position. They have to defend themselves. They have to justify why they believe in such. The hardliners are dominating the social media content, using different platforms and mobilizing people, even mobilizing schools, youth movements, universities. So this is again, this is a different, a very complicated context. It requires a different response. Here, my set point here is that people when the war started in 7th of October, there was polarization, there were different perceptions. Traditionally, some people were not happy with Hamas, some people were against the actions of certain groups. So there was polarization, there were diverse perspectives from the beginning. But the longevity of the conflict, the continuation of the problems in Gaza, as well as the broadcasting of these issues on social media, like instantly, all of this has eroded the diversity of perspectives. It has now become the dominant perspective is the one that is against the conflict or against Israel, the actions of Israel, and the others are in a defensive position. And then the fourth point, that's very Iraq specific. In Iraq, you have got armed organizations. These armed organizations need conflicts to sustain themselves. Whether this is a conflict with the Americans, this is a conflict with Sunnis, certain Sunni organizations, with ISIS remnants, with Kurdish political parties, they have to find a conflict to sustain themselves. In my view, conflict is the livelihood, is the blood, and the main source of sustainability for these groups. So these groups have started, have sought to leverage the war to acquire more resources. So as I mentioned in my first point, direct confrontations, more than 100 attacks. So drones involved with different sophisticated weapons involved. These groups also found themselves in a position that they need to develop their weapons and their military skills and activities. So in addition to mobilizing people using the different platforms, they are leading, mobilizing people around the concepts of violence, resistance violence, but also technically they have found this is the opportunity to acquire more resources. And my last point, again, this is, in my view, this is very important point when we discuss the impact of the conflict on the narratives and perceptions of people. So there is widespread societal dissatisfaction with how the Arab local as well as Muslim leaders and communities have handled the situation in Gaza, widening the gap between the public and governing powers in the region. So we are talking about the region where already the legitimacy of many authorities is limited and seriously questioned by different local groups. And what has been happening since October, it has further eroded the trust, and people's believe that the leaders can respond to their demands and opinions about what's happening. A lot of these leaders are seen by segments of the population as agents, as clients, proxies, not doing enough. So these are 5 key points in general. The message, the key point that I've been trying to say is that some of these have already happened. The war has already had immediate short-term impact. Iraq became one of the parties to the conflict because of Iran is leading some of the groups in Iraq, as well as the American bases in the country. These are more short-term in the consequences of the conflict, and we are already very familiar with it. And then the second part is the long-term questions of trust between public and the authorities, the rise of hardliners dominating social media content. All of these require, and the perceptions of people towards Western institutions beyond Western government, all of these require more nuanced, more comprehensive response and approach, addressing the long-term implications of these problems on the efforts of people, both in the region and outside, towards peace and coexistence, and consensus and dialogue. So we are. I don't think we can restore the situation to pre-7th of October. The region has changed. It requires also a substantial change in our interventions. Thank you, Vivi. I will stop from here.
Kamaran, for your very insightful views on all the developments and the different levels of developments in Iraq. One question particularly related to this last point that you're making about the sort of the vertical polarization that is now also taking place within Iraq, the widening of the gap between the population and the government, the dissatisfaction of the population with the government's action so far. How does that relate to the recent attacks by Iran to Israel, where there was also allegedly some attacks coming from Iraq launched against Israel? Can you reflect a little bit on that? Is that also a reflection from the population on that?
Yeah. So again, if I simplify the security and political landscape, so in Iraq, there are groups who align themselves with Iran strategically and religiously, ideologically. So the Iraqis, funded by the Iraqi government, by the Iraqi budget, but they respond to the authorities in Tehran. So there are groups, and if you, they have already got around 100,000 members. So we are not talking about few thousands, few hundreds. Their number, 100,000s, very well based, very well settled. And then, but also in Iraq, you have got the American facilities, American offices and bases, and the coalition. So, and also Iraq is an immediate neighbor to Iran, and Iran is leading the narrative for the Hamas camp, if I say, in the Middle East. My city, which has been stable for many years, it has become part of the conflict. So Iran directly attacked not only the American bases in Erbil, but also the infrastructure, the airport, the civilians. So I think people all of a sudden found themselves, they are part of the conflict, and they have no immediate influence, as well as this is not their conflict, but the conflict is happening in their own territory and impacting the well-being of the entire population. So I believe that the security consequence of the conflict is not over, because the elements are still there. American bases are there. The armed groups are there. Iran is still there. Whenever there is a new opportunity, these groups will come back and further destabilize the region. To be nuanced, this problem is not entirely an outcome of what's happening in Gaza. It did exist before the conflict. It has an independent existence, but the conflict has further renewed this conflict and provided a new space and further complicated efforts towards solution.
Well, that's pretty clear. Thank you so much. I don't see, well, there is one other question. Let me check. Here is a question from Marco, if I can get the full screen. Yeah, so he's saying, I often hear the word the West passing by. Where is the responsibility of the Arab countries and for peace instead of violence? The West supports Israel, but the West supports the Palestinian and gives money and goods. What is that is where the West does take responsibility. Within democratic countries, there are discussions going on in which all countries are talking to each other about what's happening in Israel and Gaza. Where are these open discussions in the Arab countries? Well, I suppose we can discuss on the openness of the discussions in the West, but we'll come to that. And then there's also a question from George Cafford. Nice to have you on board, George, our former colleague. Really interesting, thank you. I have a bit of a packed question in Iraq, particularly. How has the aftermath of October 7 and these attacks claims from Iranian-backed militias impacted their popularity? Are the attacks claims from these groups like an al-Mukawama al-Islamiyya fi al-Iraqi being broadcast widely on multiple platforms of traditional and social media? And how are Iraqi Kurds, Sunni Arabs, and Shia responding to these? So would you like to pick up on these questions, Kamran?
Yeah, like a very quick reaction to the first question about the Arab position of the Arab countries. I forgot to mention in my introduction that prior to 7th of October, there was a serious normalization happening between some Arab states and Israel. So I went to Dubai last year. I could see the normalization happening on the street. So there was a serious effort, and what happened in October also threatened the normalization efforts that have been taking place for many years. Here's probably we need to, in a different panel discussing the intra-Arab conflicts and power rivalry, how different groups have fought so to exploit the conflict in their own internal power rivalry, like Qatar versus Saudi Arabia, Qatar versus UAE. This is a different topic, but there is also not a unified position among the Arab systems and regimes. So their understanding towards their relations with the Muslim Brotherhood, as they see as the broader framework, and Hamas is part of it, and also they have to respond to the demands of the population. So there is a complexity when it comes to the position of Arab states. The last one, about the other questions about armed groups in Iraq. I believe that since October, the main protests that took place in Iraq are known as the Tishrin movement, the October movement. Some people call the revolution in 2019. The armed organizations have lost popularity significantly since October 2019 because they found themselves clashing with the protest movements, killing them using violence. So they have not been able to restore their popularity that they gained during the fight against ISIS. Still, like there is one thing that, in my view, this is a very important observation to mention. There is a significant generational change happening in Iraq. The majority of Iraqis are around 60% of Iraqi's population, and we are talking about a country of more than 40 million people, are younger than 20 years old. So meaning that they have no direct contact and memory with what happened in 2003 with the previous regime. You have got a new population in Iraq. They are mostly worried about socioeconomic issues. I'm not saying this is the end of identity politics. This is not the end of ethno-sectarian politics in Iraq, but the younger Iraqis are less interested about ethno-sectarian divisions compared to previous generations. They are very much interested in governance issues, and that is why there is a common language across the communities. A young Kurd can communicate with a young Shia in the south. Similarly, a young Sunni can talk to a young Shia in other cities. Why? Because they have common issues and demands and grievances towards against mismanagement, corruption, these issues, and also demands around socioeconomy. So the armed groups, in my view, will find, even in the future, will find a very difficult. They will struggle to build popularity, because younger Iraqis are not interested in conflicts. They are just tired. When you talk to them, they say, "We are just tired. We want some rest." And that, I'm trying to simplify it, but that is really the change happening across the youthful population of Iraqis.
Thank you so much, Kamran. It's quite a technical question, but on this point, soon there will be a policy brief published at ICCT by you, who will also address this issue. So I just will tell my audience to stay tuned and follow what's coming. We move a little bit further north and also a little bit further to the west, just slightly, to Lebanon. And for that, we have Christina Four, co-founder of Fighters for Peace Lebanon. Christina, I gladly hand over the floor to you.
Yes, thank you, Bibi. Thank you for inviting me to this panel today. Yeah, I'm currently sitting in a small village in southeastern Lebanon. It's our mountain house. We are not very far from Syria. We're not far from the Golan Heights. We're about, I think, less than 30 kilometers from the southern border, which borders with Israel. We're around maybe 10 kilometers away from the Sheba farms, which have been frequently attacked by the Israeli army. So I'm, I think, probably giving you a bit of a more personal account here today than some of my colleagues here. So yeah, we were on 8th of October 2023, we were in this house when at 7 o'clock in the morning, I woke up and I heard the sound of bombs. And of course, the previous day, 7th of October, my husband and I, we had been glued to the TV screen for hours and hours in disbelief of the Hamas attack into Israel, and in disbelief also on how they were doing it with the paragliders and so on. Which then in the following days, especially these paragliders were sterilized into freedom fighters and heroes by, you know, the public here in Lebanon, even by leftist academics, Lebanese academics, who in general have nothing to share with Hamas fighters. So this was like the mood, and of course, we were afraid immediately what would be the response of Hezbollah, because Hezbollah very often speaks about, you know, how they could finish Israel within a couple of minutes, how their rockets and bombs could reach Tel Aviv in a couple of minutes, and so on and so on. So we were in a high state of high alert after 7th of October. And of course, our nervousness then increased when we were in the morning waking up to the sound of bombs. And then we packed our bags and moved back to Beirut. Then just being informed by the German embassy, I'm German, but I've been living in Lebanon for 24 years, married to a Lebanese. So the German embassy informed us that we should possibly move back to Germany, which we did because we had a project there, not because of the warning from the embassy. But then we didn't stay there very long and returned to Lebanon. So what happened on 7th of October and the aftermath and the war in Gaza has had very, you know, unsettling effects on us as a family, on Lebanon as a country as well, on the internal security and peace as well. And I want to talk a little bit about the mood and the situation here in Lebanon, which is probably not exactly what you would expect, or is not exactly what is being portrayed in Western media either. You know, Hezbollah is a military organization, but also is represented in the Lebanese parliament with deputies, with ministers. Recently, the acting prime minister of Lebanon was interviewed, and he said, you know, when Hezbollah shot the first rockets towards Israel on 8th of October, he was not informed, and he had no say in this. And more recently, also more and more Christian leaders, religious leaders, political leaders have been distancing themselves from Hezbollah. Even some former quite close Christian allies of Hezbollah said that this is not our war, and Hezbollah has been acting without the consent of the Lebanese government, and also without the consent of the majority of the Lebanese people. And actually, I think later October or beginning of November, there was an opinion poll which said that 72% of the Lebanese population do not want to be dragged into a full-scale war. So this is a little bit the mood. And actually, yes, of course, the conflict in Gaza has had this immediate spillover into Lebanon. Now going into the 6 month, around 90,000 people from South Lebanon have been displaced. Over 260 Hezbollah fighters and some fighters from other factions have been killed. Villages and towns in South Lebanon have been destroyed. And this brings back really bad memories, because the last war between Hezbollah and Israel was in 2006. And I still remember it. Many people still remember it. The south, again, was widely destroyed. Even southern suburbs of Beirut, which has a very high presence of Hezbollah, has been destroyed, but also Lebanese infrastructure was destroyed back in 2006. The airport, the runways of the airport was destroyed. Most major bridges were destroyed, and so on. So it had a huge impact back then. And I think it's true. This opinion poll is quite true, that you know, the big majority of the Lebanese do not want to be dragged into a new war, because they still remember what that means from 2006. We live in a situation of high insecurity and high tension on one hand. On the other hand, the war has been pretty much constrained to the southern border, with some exceptional attacks, for example, in the region of Baalbek, which is in the center of the country, or even the southern suburbs, a very targeted attack on when Hamas leaders were meeting. But mainly it has been restricted to the south, where Hezbollah is active. And in other cities, like in the capital Beirut, life has been going on pretty much normal, except for the daily, drones, Israeli drones that you can hear, and this adds just to the normal, like to the tension and to the nervousness that people are feeling, even though they're able to lead relatively normal lives. And like personally, I also have my emergency bag packed and ready with my papers and so on. So this is like the situation of many Lebanese. So the question if the conflict in Gaza has had a horizontal or vertical polarizing effect on society, well, I see it more as a horizontal conflict or polarizing effect. So you have Hezbollah on one hand, they're doing their own thing. They are a non-state actor which was able over the decades to create a state within the state. They do not really care about what the Lebanese prime minister has to say. They rather, would direct their queries towards the authorities in Iran. And they're heavily armed, as you know, so they feel that they can pretty much do whatever they want, and they don't need to take or they don't need to consult the Lebanese authorities. So in this way, Lebanon is being held hostage politically, if you want, by Hezbollah. And this is increasingly to the disliking also of Lebanese authorities. As I mentioned, the prime minister voiced criticism, some Christian religious leaders and politicians voiced criticism. Christians also in the south of Lebanon say this is not our war, we're being totally overlooked. So in this sense, I see it more as a horizontal polarization between Hezbollah and some other Islamic faction on one side, and the rest of even Lebanon's institutions and the Lebanese people on the other side. So the Hezbollah's actions have even, caused a rift of the alliances within the political spectrum in Lebanon. As I mentioned, Christian parties that were strong allies of Hezbollah have been increasingly distancing themselves from Hezbollah's military actions. So this causes, an upheaval within the Lebanese political scene and causes more instability, at least. I would like to talk a little bit also about the Palestinian presence in Lebanon. So since 1948, Palestinian refugees have come to Lebanon, and there's now, I guess, around 400,000 Palestinian refugees, many of them descendants of the refugees from 1948. And it's a fairly large number if you consider that Lebanon is a small country if you do not consider the 1.5 million Syrian refugees in the country, Lebanon has probably a population of around 5 million persons. So the Palestinian refugee population is quite large. And of course, in the beginning, in the aftermath, immediate aftermath of 7th of October, many Palestinians were very enthusiastic, and they were seeing themselves already going back to Jerusalem and so on. But now I think their wake-up call came pretty quick, and they are now very, very realistic, if not to say very desperate and hopeless. But because of the Palestinian presence in Lebanon, I think this is one of the reasons why you haven't seen mass demonstrations in favor of the people in Gaza, because the Palestinians were involved in the Lebanese civil war as well, and were one major cause for the Lebanese civil war, because you had Palestinian armed groups that used Lebanon as a territory or as a base to fight against Israel. And because of this history, and not very far away history, the Lebanese civil war happened from 1975 to 1990. I think because of that history, you have not seen mass demonstrations in Beirut or other cities as happened, you know, in London, in New York, or in Australia or Southeast Asia. Because of that delicate, you know, balance within the Lebanese population, because of that Palestinian presence and their former role in the civil war. And not all Lebanese like this Palestinian presence. So that's why I think you haven't seen any huge demonstrations. But having said that, I mean, you know, listening to the media, talking to friends, reading articles, being on social media and so on, the vast, like the overall feeling of the Lebanese people is with the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. And there's no one, hardly, at least not publicly in any case, who would support Israel's right to defend itself. And also because, you know, Lebanon since 1948 has never reached a meaningful peace agreement with Israel. Lebanon is still in a state of war officially with Israel. So if you were to speak in favor of Israel, you could be accused of treason and end up in front of a military court. And even if there are singular voices in support of Israel, you won't not find them in public. But yeah, the general sentiment is definitely in solidarity with the Palestinians, and especially with the civilians. If there are any signs of grievances turning into ground for recruitment, that was one of the questions. I just want to answer quickly.
Christina, yeah, no, just because we're running a little bit out of time, if you can really summarize that in like two sentences.
Yeah, okay. I don't see it, to be honest, because I mean, Hezbollah is there, they have their fighters, even Hamas has a couple of fighters. I don't think that the war in Gaza led to you know, a ground for recruitment, because they already have their fighters. That could be a quick answer. Yeah, and the last question that I wanted to tackle quickly, but it has been said already by my colleagues Martin and by Cameron, it's very similar in Lebanon, the feeling towards the West. Basically, the West has lost all its credibility. They do not have any moral authority anymore. Yeah, there has been a lot of resentment, like negative resentment towards the West here in Lebanon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina, for also that personal account of how you have experienced the attacks during 7th of October and the days after. it's a rather harsh reality to be sitting and doing this live briefing with a flight back right next to you, just in case you get a message that you really have to try to find safety. I mean, that's not a reality that all of us can fully understand, I suppose. I think on that last point, what is interesting, and we talked a little bit about that, maybe just quickly to delve into that point a little further. You mentioned Lebanon still being at war with Israel, meaning that everyone siding with Israel risks, or working with any Israeli organization risks prosecution for treason, which obviously might put you into difficult positions also in research projects, in other kind of cooperations, pretty much like we've heard from Cameron as well. And maybe you can say a few words about how working, for instance, with German organizations that are sponsoring projects, but then ask you to also signs or give your support to the resolution that was adopted by the German Parliament, which then puts you at a very difficult position. Maybe you can say a few words on that to make people understand the conflict that you're constantly in.
Yeah, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm German, but I've been living here for 24 years. So yes, and I'm part of a civil society organization, a local organization here. And since I'm German, of course, for me, the easiest is to go to Germany and seek German funding as well. But we're, of course, not the only ones. Germany and Lebanon is the second largest donor country after the US. So many civil society organizations are depending on such funding, or the UN are also partially depending on such funding. And a couple of years ago, the German parliament voted in favor of a resolution to not to support the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. It is not a law, it was a recommendation, but some German donors ask their partners to distance themselves basically from the BDS movement. And we were recently asked to sign an official, or send them an official letter or declaration saying that we would not question Israel's right to exist. We then explained to them that we cannot do this because of the Lebanese law, no matter what our opinion would be in this matter. But it would bring us in conflict with Lebanese law. So similarly to what Cameron said in Iraq and Iraqi civil society organizations, it's also, I could observe this here, that NGOs have been giving back funds to German donors in particular. Yeah, because this is really a conflict for us. And I know from diplomatic sources from EU donor countries that they're even worried about future cooperation, you know, between Lebanese organizations and institutions and European donor countries because of that conflict in Gaza, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christina. I think that last point was very a good illustration of that constant tension. I'm gonna break the session for 5 minutes for everyone to stretch their legs, get a cup of coffee, tea, some water, or a quick sanitary stop, and then we'll be back in 5 minutes. See you in 5. Welcome back, everyone. We're moving further up north and we will land in the West Balkan region. And for that, we have Adrian Stooney with us to talk us about the developments over there. Adrian, you have the floor.
Thank you, Bibi. Can you hear me? Excellent. Thank you for organizing this event. I mean, it's such a loaded problem set, as we can see even from the comments and from the discussions. It has polarized societies across the board. Unfortunately, it has done the same thing in the Balkans. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit more specific terms, even considering the social political setting in the Balkans and how things are converging and are creating a situation that leads to more polarization and potential radicalization and unfortunately even political violence. As we've seen even from our colleagues who've already discussed, everyone who follows the developments in the Middle East has by now witnessed the substantial security and humanitarian implications of the 7th of October terrorist attacks that then were followed by the full-fledged war in Gaza. We have about 35,000 people killed at this point, about 2 million people displaced, not only Palestinians, but also Israelis in the north because of the shelling of Hamas, Hezbollah, sorry. Unfortunately, we've seen all the destruction. The United Nations are calling the destruction, the scale and the speed of the destruction witnessed in Gaza in the past few months unprecedented. Not only that, but the recent exchange of drones and missiles between Iran and Israel showed that the longer the Gaza conflict rages on, the higher are the risks of the Middle East being engulfed in a regional war. Even considering the other actors that are operating in the region, from the Houthis and other militias in Iraq, Hezbollah, and so on. All of these developments, of course, and dynamics that we talked about and we'll continue to discuss are known to galvanize radicalization and political violence, which is not limited by geographical boundaries. Of course, clearly what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. It has ramifications for security all over the world. And we've witnessed this during the war in Syria and Iraq. It has had implications for security in Europe. And because there has been a lot of security threats, there has been an uptick in radicalization, both online and offline. There's been increased domestic terrorist activities. There's been infiltration of refugee and irregular migratory waves by terrorist groups who then have ended up carrying out terrorist attacks in European soil. Suffice it to mention the terrorist attacks in Paris in November 2015, the Bataclan, basically 130 killed, 400 plus injured. And also there has been the other effect, massive effect, departures of European citizens to join terrorist organizations operating and fighting in Syria and Iraq. We're talking about somewhere north of 6,000 people from the Western Europe. Now, again, the Western Balkans are a region in Europe, Southeastern Europe, and they were not an exception during the Syria and Iraq conflict. There was about 1,100 individuals from the countries of the Western Balkans that left and joined terrorist organizations in Syria and Iraq, primarily the Islamic State. But again, geographically, looking at where the Western Balkans is, basically, it's a land bridge that connects Europe to Asia, connects Europe to the Middle East, and it's geographically sensitive to turmoil in the neighboring regions. But it's also the region within Europe that has the largest indigenous Muslim community. So the conflict in Gaza has a particular resonance in the region. There's arguably more attention to this particular conflict compared to other conflicts that are raging on right now. There's more interest to consume news from this conflict. Unfortunately, not always accurate news. There's more sensitivity due to religious affinity, as I mentioned. And inevitably, this ongoing crisis has a greater impact at the socio-political level. Now, one other relevant element we need to emphasize here in order to understand the backdrop, to understand the broader picture in the Western Balkans, is that the region has a recent past that was marked by and even defined by ethno-religious wars, to the extent that it remains a region with recurring ethnic tensions, and in some cases, highly polarized societies to this day living segregated along ethnic and religious lines. Primarily, I'm talking about Bosnia and Kosovo. And there are many studies that provide ample evidence that highly polarized socio-political environments, like the ones I just described, are significantly more vulnerable to disinformation, prone to hate speech, radicalization, and then political violence as well. So basically, the concern here is that in a highly polarized environment with volatile interethnic dynamics, and as I mentioned, I'm talking primarily about Bosnia and Kosovo here, a rising level of online and offline hate speech, disinformation related to the Israel-Hamas war could accelerate radicalization, and that's what we're seeing online, which in turn may increase the likelihood of political violence in a region that is marked historically by these kind of conflicts, including violence that is rooted in identity-based ideologies. So I did write a piece for ICCT already, and I'm just going to go real quick over the main points 4 or 5 main points that were made in that piece. And the first one is concerns of terrorist infiltration to the European Union via the Western Balkans route. Basically, the infiltration of migration routes or routes by terrorists transiting from conflict areas through the Western Balkans to the European Union represents a constant potential threat to public safety and overall security in Europe, especially so since the Western Balkans is one of the main migratory corridors of irregular arrivals in the European Union. And according to Frontex, basically 2023 marked a record high number of irregular entries into the European Union that was comparable to that we've seen in 2016. So in response to this perceived threat, immediately after the 7th of October terrorist attack by Hamas in Israel, 11 Schengen area countries reintroduced border controls. 7 of these countries specifically cited possible terrorist infiltrations from the route that was mentioned, and 5 of these countries specifically mentioned the Balkan route and Western Balkans as a main concern in their reasoning for adopting these measures. Although there have been no newly reported cases of potential terrorist activities along the route, we know in the past, as I mentioned, even the case of the Paris attacks in 2015, that a number of these individuals, terrorists involved in that attack, actually crossed through the Balkans, and they were they were using fake documents to portray themselves as refugees. Nevertheless, so far there hasn't been any reported cases, but still the measures introduced by the Schengen countries are still in place, which means there is a heightened concern about this problem set. What we've seen in the Balkans that is of concern is a rise in hate speech. And there has been also protests where this hate speech has been in broad display. And this is no different from what we've seen in other European Union countries, in the UK, in the United States, where there's been a considerable increase in hate speech online directed towards different, let's say to Israel. There's been also anti-Semitic rhetoric that constitutes the overwhelming majority of instances that I've been tracking on various social media platforms. But also there's been anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim hate speech in response to the dynamics there. Anti-Semitic slogans have been spotted during the pro-Palestine protests, rallies that were held in the region. It is the usual slogans. You would have a flag of Israel placed in a trash bin that would read, "Please keep the world clean." This is a clear genocidal anti-Semitic call. In other cases, the protesters chanted anti-Semitic slogans, again, from the river to the sea, Palestinians will be free. All of those, we've seen them elsewhere as well. Or there has been an implicit call for the elimination of the Jewish state, other signs equating the Star of David to the Third Reich swastika, and so on and so forth. The third thing is an observed surge in misinformation and disinformation online, but also in traditional media. There has been many cases of recycled graphic and shocking content from previous conflicts, including in other countries in the region, that were passed off as content from the current war in Gaza. There's been fake news, manipulated videos, as well as other deceptive content. This is problematic because it continues to add to the polarization of the public discourse in the region, and definitely risks fueling violent incidents and hate crime. While some of the main social media platforms have reportedly taken steps to address the proliferation of disinformation and misinformation in their platforms, the problem is that content moderation in languages that are not the major ones, like English, French, Spanish, Arabic, is much less present. So there's much less capacities that are dedicated to content moderation in these languages of the Western Balkans. And therefore, I'm not really noticing any, let's say, moderation, cleaning up of a lot of these news that is fake news and manipulated, and there is disinformation across the board. The fourth thing is concerns of another wave of foreign fighters from the region, from the Balkans to the Middle East. There is a concern. I have not seen any signs of it materializing. And of course, the concern is, as I mentioned, because very recently there was 1,100 individuals from the Balkans who traveled to Syria and Iraq to join terrorist organizations. Now, if we're looking at the rate of mobilization from a very contained pool of people, 1,100, compared to the 6,000 that traveled from the Western Europe, you will see that the rate of mobilization in the Balkans has been very high, and this is why this justifies the concern. Nevertheless, we need to differentiate the Islamic State from Hamas. It's not exactly the same thing. They use similar tactics in the way they have carried out the terrorist attacks, but while there is a difference in ideology, Hamas is an exclusively Palestinian Islamist militant organization and a party that describes itself as a Palestinian Islamic national liberation and resistance movement. And its goal is not to build a caliphate. So it's a huge difference. And also, it's very hard for anyone to travel to Gaza to join Hamas, even if they wanted to. So bottom line, the current risk of a new wave of Western Balkans foreign fighters, similar to the one we saw in Syria and Iraq, is very low. But the assessment might change depending on how the conflict develops and if it spreads in the region. The fifth and the last element of what I looked into is the fact that the borders are very porous. There is an illegal flow of weaponry, military grade weapons, and there's been paramilitary violence. Especially, we're talking about a very disturbing incident in the northern part of Kosovo that was basically was a deadly attack that left 4 people dead. There was 1 police officer that was targeted by this paramilitary group and 3 gunmen. And this happened in a matter of weeks before, a couple of weeks before the attack in Israel. So the Kosovo authorities openly accused the Serb government of being behind the attack, while the Serbian authorities denied involvement. They have done close to nothing to have the leader of this paramilitary group and its members face any legal consequences for this action. And by the way, the leader of the paramilitary group confessed to planning, organizing, financing the attack, and he is free despite the fact that Interpol is looking for him and the other 30 plus individuals who carried out the attack that could have destabilized not just Kosovo, but the whole region. And this is not an isolated incident. And unfortunately, this is extremely problematic in light of other developments in the region. It was the latest in a chain of escalatory violent attacks by ethnic Serbs targeting Kosovo law enforcement and NATO forces. And again, you still have peacekeeping forces in Kosovo because of what I described before as a conflict that still hasn't been resolved thoroughly. The concern here in terms of terrorism is that we saw a large arsenal of military grade weapons crossing borders illegally. And they were seized in northern Kosovo. But we're talking about a massive cache of military-grade weapons. And again, there was a large number of military or paramilitary individuals that were part of this group, militants, involved in the attack. Both these things, the flow of weapons and the flow of militants, so easily between, across borders, highlights how porous the borders continue to be and how easily militant groups can smuggle and deploy operatives and weapons across them. So to conclude, against this backdrop of fragile balances in the Western Balkans and frozen conflicts that are beginning to thaw, unfortunately, converging security pressures originating from the war in Gaza as the conflict stretches on, risk compounding the region's security challenges. And that is very problematic, not just for the region, but for Europe more broadly.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrian, for taking us through the West Balkans and also reminding us of the very fragile situation related to the history clearly. One question that's been asked in the Q&A is whether if people cannot join Hamas, obviously for the reasons that it's very difficult to cross the borders in Gaza, would there be a chance that individuals that are interested or willing or go a step further than just sympathizing would join other groups that are active in the region itself?
It's a very good question, and it wasn't an accident that I mentioned the developments in terms of political violence, not only in the Middle East, but also political violence within the region. And I mentioned specifically that there is a ethnic religious combo when it comes to conflicts in the Balkans. As I mentioned, we are going through a very polarized period of time in the Balkans, especially I'm talking about Bosnia, I'm talking about Kosovo. In Bosnia, there is massive problems that are being created by Milorad Dodik, who is a secessionist politician of Republika Srpska, and they are creating dynamics there, threatening all the time with secession, threatening all the time with dismantling basically whatever peace and peaceful resolution has been put in place to keep Bosnia from falling apart. So he's continuing to threaten all the time with secession in a very fragile socio-political environment. Same thing we discussed earlier in terms of the dynamics within northern Kosovo, but also dynamics between Serbia and Kosovo. So in this polarized environment, when you have had a very recent clear experience of radicalization, recruitment, and mobilization into violent extremism and terrorist organizations, it is a very valid concern that radicalization that is happening right now, that has been galvanized by what's happening in Gaza, could lead to activities within the region, of activities of political violence within the region, or a radicalization that leads to mobilization with other groups that espouse political violence elsewhere. And it's a huge problem because we're seeing that, again, what's happening in Gaza is exacerbating existing socio-political vulnerabilities and polarization, as well as security challenges. So don't also forget that the Western Balkans currently has the highest concentration of returnees from Syria and Iraq in Europe. And I'm talking about Western Balkans are the only countries in Europe that have voluntarily repatriated known foreign fighters who had joined the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. And due to the short sentences that were given upon repatriation, pretty much all of them will be out by the end of this year in the society, out of prison. I mean, they would have served their prison sentences. So it is a problematic situation where you have all of these converging issues. As I mentioned, the porous borders and the flow of weapons and the way the militants can cross borders apparently seamlessly. So yes, there is that issue.
Thank you very much, Adrian. We move to our last speaker on a region or on a city, and after that, we have Peter Knope here with us, former director of ICCT, who will give his reflections and highlight a couple of the overarching trends that came forward through the different presentations. We're running a little late, so hopefully you can stay tuned. But first we turn to Taco Temmink-Tuinstra, who is the advisor to the mayor of Amsterdam. And we'll talk about the situation in Amsterdam. Taco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bibi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. First of all, thank you and thanks to the International Center for Counter-Terrorism for hosting this webinar. In view of current world events, listening to these inspirational speakers all over the world is important and learning and encouraging experience. So I'd like to thank all the speakers as well for their stories and ideas. Frankly, my story is different. It's from a relatively peaceful Amsterdam, far away from Gaza and Israel. But it's a city. Amsterdam is a city of minorities, and our city runs on empathy and tolerance. And however, this empathy and tolerance is under great pressure due to the situation in Israel and Gaza right now. And the effect it's having on Amsterdam especially, but also other Western cities, I'd like to explain in a few words the coming minutes. In the city of Amsterdam has condemned the brutal attack by the Hamas terrorists. It has called for attention for the dire situation of the people in Gaza and is contributing financially and humanitarian aid is also from the city of Amsterdam towards the people of Gaza. The Israel government deserves harsh criticism for violating human rights and international law in Gaza and on the West Bank. Nevertheless, we have to deal with the impact of the aftermath in our city. After the 7th of October, we have almost daily protests of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people gathering in our streets and squares, mostly in solidarity of the Palestinians, but also people in support of Israel. As a city, we stand for the freedom of protest and the freedom of expression. However, the Jewish people here in Amsterdam and anywhere else in the world should not be blamed for the wrongdoings of the government of Israel. And in this city, which didn't prevent the murder of 60,000 Jewish residents during the Holocaust of the Second World War, the city government cannot be silent when anti-Semitism rears its ugly head, as it does today. So our major calls on everyone who feels solidarity with Palestinians to behave with empathy towards the Jewish community, also here in Amsterdam. She urges everyone to continue to make a distinction between the government of Israel and the Jewish people. It must be clear that everyone here has the right to be critical on the government of Israel. However, there's no right to criticize Jewish people. Only if this state of mind, nuanced dialogue is still possible, and also referring to one of the questions, should also be possible in universities in my personal opinion. Our city calls on everyone to look beyond the positions people take in this conflict and see basic humanity that we all share. At this time, the increased number of accounts of anti-Semitism, but also the increase of Islamophobia and racism demands everyone to see the human perspective. We are all human beings. Let me finish by now reflecting on the first three questions that the ICCT raised. How is the Israel-Hamas conflict impacting the public debate in the Netherlands? Is a nuanced dialogue still possible? I think there is still a possibility, and we try to find that on a daily matter. But it's complicated, and it demands a lot of empathy from the people and our city. The city government, and especially our mayor, speaks almost on a weekly basis with representatives of the Jewish community, of the Palestinian community, and other Islamic communities. This occurs most of the time in separate meetings. Some supporters of the Palestinian cause and members of the Jewish community initiate dialogues and promote mutual understanding in Amsterdam. Despite their sometimes strong disagreements, they are doing everything they can to prevent the conflict from escalating here in Amsterdam. And we as a city support these peaceful efforts. Question 2 goes on the conflict, if it has a horizontal or vertical polarizing effect in Dutch society. Well, we can say that both is the case. The conflict deepens divisions between different communities in Amsterdam, including Jewish, Muslim, and other communities. People may hold strong and opposing views on the conflict based on their personal experiences, identities, or political beliefs. This can lead to increased tensions, misunderstandings, and a sense of us versus them. And this goes on in different groups. But there's also vertical polarization here in Amsterdam, which happened a day after the 7th of October when our council decided to raise the Israeli flag. People got angry, and when citizens feel that their concerns or perspectives are not adequately represented or addressed by authorities, it contributes to vertical polarization. A few days later, we decided to raise the peace flag. The third and final question: are the signs of perceived grievance turning into a ground for recruitment in Amsterdam? The current answer is that we are monitoring this, but there's no data that supports that the Israel-Gaza conflict amplifies recruitment for terrorism now. Well, grievance related to the Israel-Gaza conflict may contribute to vulnerabilities that extremists recruiters exploit. It's essential to consider these issues within the broader context of local dynamics, global trends in extremism, and community-specific factors. The city has currently no data that this is the case, but we are following that with our people from intelligence. I think that's from Amsterdam a short summary on what's going on here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Taco, for taking us on a tour through Amsterdam. Normally, people would love to come for the touristic sites, etc. But the reality of having to deal with demonstrations on a daily basis, really, prevention of escalation is hard work. I noted down. I think now you're constantly working on that. It's constantly on the agenda of the mayor, and that already tells us how this conflict has also reached our cities. And you were kind enough to already go into one of the questions that was asked about a student who says, well, in our universities, we see that professors and academics have been instructed to refrain from addressing the topic of the Israeli war on Palestinians. Pro-Palestinian dissident voices have been met with opposition and silencing from the university administration. And he asks himself, how are we as a young generation supposed to freely exercise our freedom of political expression if we are unable to challenge different political views on the premises of honorable research institutions? Can we really initiate change? We are tired of being mere bystanders. And I think this is a reflection of a sentiment that's widely felt throughout populations, communities, something that we as researchers in this field also see, because the discussions there's so much tension on the discussion, it almost seems that that middle ground is just cut out. You're either in favor or against, to speak with President Bush right after 9/11. There is, let me see in the questions. I think most of them have been covered. I'd like to now turn over to Peter Knope for his reflections on the presentations, and maybe you can highlight a couple of points. And I'm just encouraging everyone, if you still have questions or remarks to share, please do so in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Bibi. I've got 5 points, and I don't think I need too much of your time today. My first one is really an open door, but it's important to mention the open door. I think from the presentations from Iraq and Lebanon, it became very obvious, very clear that especially the countries in the neighborhood of Israel, Gaza, are specific, they're different, and the reactions are different. The position of and the influence of Iran, Hamas, the influence of the position of Palestinians in Lebanon, I think Christina mentioned it, the position of Palestinians in Jordan or in Syria they cannot be compared. Historically, culturally, politically, the positions of these countries internally are different. So they require and they need to have a specific approach and analysis of what is happening. In the Gulf is different again. So and within the Gulf there's different positions. So I think the fact that you had different presentations from different countries is important, and to keep that specifics in sight is, I think, very relevant. The second one is very unpleasant, but I hear from all corners that the West is the big loser in all of this. The West has lost credibility, it's lost its moral position. And somebody said, I think it was Cameron that said, and that doesn't only include the governments, it includes the West more in more blanket terms. So the West, as we sit here, has lost some of its position in the world through what happened in the Middle East. Now that is an important statement, and I heard it from almost everybody. And it feeds into the decolonization narrative. The decolonization that is happening in West Africa, that is an important part of what is politically happening. It happens in Asia, the decolonization process is happening there, and it happens in the Middle East. So the lack of credibility and the lack of position of the West in blanket terms, that mixes with the decolonization narrative, that is, by the way, encouraged by some actors globally. It doesn't come by itself. It's provoked. But it's important to note that because it changes the international setup. It changes the position of the P5. It changes the position of the West in the world. It changes the international and the vulnerability of the United States on 9/11 was a very important trigger element of what happened after 9/11. The fact that the West is losing its position is a very important element of what is going to happen next. Number 3. There's been a couple of failures. One of them is the failure of Israel to exploit their improved relationship. And I think it was Martin that mentioned it. But the improved relationship of Israel wasn't only in Africa. It also happened in the Middle East. There was a change of position of Israel that stood with its back against the Middle East, and that position of Israel was changing in the last 4, 5, 6 years. And Israel has failed to exploit that changed and improved relationship. On the contrary, it has lost that position in the last 6 months. And that is important because it has international political ramifications. Then number 4, Israel has failed to control the narratives, and so has the West. So the narratives are controlled by somebody else. There is this is not just a war with guns and weapons, it's also a war on narratives. Who controls the narratives? Now, the West has failed to control that, but Israel has failed to control it. And you could maybe even claim that Hamas or Iran has more control over the narratives than the others. Now, that is an important, because it has, again, that has consequences. It has led to expansion of tensions, shift of sympathies. I think Martin mentioned it very clearly. And that is not only in the region, it's also in Africa and it's in Europe. So this shift of sympathies as a result of the failure to control the narratives is extremely important. And then maybe my 4th point is that Israel has also failed to control and contain the conflict. It's expanding. There